and excitable. And he says, man, when you finally get old, it's kind of a relief to not have all of that stuff. And we'll immediately think of sex, but of course there's a whole lot more to it than that. He says, desires are kind of dangerous. This is the way he says it. He says, intellect is the best gift of nature or God. To this divine gift and endowment, there is nothing so inimical as desire and pleasure, right? Desire for pleasure. For when appetite is our master, there is no place for self-control. You kind of knew that one was coming. That would be a pretty easy one, right? He says, as we age, he says, we learn actually a different kind of wisdom, right? And this one I think is an interesting idea. A different kind of pleasure will happen because of wisdom. He says, indeed, this is in passage 14. Indeed, if it has in store any of what I call the food of study and philosophy, nothing can be pleasanter than an old age of leisure. So he makes the observation: as long as you continue to learn and read and study, you'll never not have pleasure even as you age, right? He continues. He says, "There are tastes too connected with learning, which in men of sense and good education grow with their growth. It's indeed an honorable sentiment, which Solon expresses in a verse which I've quoted before, that he grew old learning many a fresh lesson every day." Wow, what a great idea. Grew old learning a fresh lesson every day. It reminds us of Longfellow's Psalm of Life, right? That notion of art is long and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave. Not enjoyment and not sorrow as our death's an end away, but to act, that each tomorrow find us further than today, right? Then he says, back to passage 14, intellectual pleasure, none certainly can be greater. That's the most important thing, is to have that intellectual growth and intellectual pleasure. Old age, he says, has tremendous pleasure in growing things. We're familiar with the final lines, reminded of the final lines from Voltaire's Candide. We each must cultivate our own garden. He says, can anything be richer in product or more beautiful to contemplate than gardening? In other words, he says, one of the great things about growing old is that you can begin to enjoy gardening and growing things. Of course, his argument is going to be, when you're young, learn how to grow things. And as you get older, it'll even be more of an enjoyable thing for you. He says it this way. He says, in my opinion, scarcely any life can be more blessed, not alone from its utility, for agriculture is beneficial to the whole human race, but also as much from the mere pleasure of the thing to which I have already alluded, and from the rich abundance and supply of all things necessary for the food of man and the worship of the gods above. So, as these are objects of desire to certain people, let us make our peace with pleasure. For the good and hard-working farmer's wine cellar and oil store, as well as his larder, are always well filled, and his whole farmhouse is richly furnished. Now, scholars have pointed out that Cicero was a real believer that what was wrong with current Rome was that too many people were living in the city and not enough people were living out on the land. This is, of course, ironic because I'm lecturing, obviously, in a small agrarian town. So you've heard this argument growing up all your life. If you grow up working on a farm, you obviously have certain kinds of value sets that you've learned from the fact that you had to get up in the early morning and go to work, etc., etc. For Cicero, he's going to make the argument, though, that growing stuff is a profound way to never grow old, never age, right? The next thing he says to the answer about loss of physical pleasure is that it's true that you do lose certain kinds of abilities. We think, of course, of sexual gratifications or whatever. But he says old age brings influence, and that one, he says, is really cool. He says the last period of an old age is more blessed than that of middle age, inasmuch as the individual has greater influence and less labor. For the crowning grace of old age is influence. I think that's a compelling line. The crowning grace of old age is influence. In other words, the older you live, the more influence you should have, because young people are willing to hear what you have to say. Now, for those of you that say, well, that's a load of garbage, I would say to you, yeah, but don't you expect freshmen to show you respect? And when you speak to freshmen, you kind of think that probably they should listen because you know some things they don't know, right? He continues with this notion of the idea of influence by saying, what then are the physical pleasures to be compared with the reward of influence? Those who have employed it with distinction appear to me to have played the drama of life to its end, and not to have broken down in the last act like unpracticed players. But it will be said, old men are fretful, fidgety, ill-tempered, and disagreeable. If you come to that, they are also avaricious. But these are faults of character, not at the time of life. And after all, fretfulness and the other faults I mentioned admit of some excuse, not indeed a complete one, but one that may possibly pass muster. They think themselves neglected, looked down upon, mocked. Besides, with bodily weakness, every rub is a source of pain. Yet all these faults are softened both by good character and good education. I mean, think of it this way. How many 50-year-olds do you know or older who wake up every morning and go, yes, another day I get to live, this is awesome, as opposed to, oh man, I hate my life. Of course, the question of, you're halfway to 40, by the way, just to remind you, right? You're right, halfway to 40 at 20. And soon you'll be 20, right? Halfway to 40, the question is, what kind of 40-year-old will you be? I mean, will you be the kind of 40-year-old that young, people like your age now will look at it and say, that's the kind of person I want to be like. Why? Because they have enthusiasm and energy and motivation and all those kinds of things. Or are you going to look at, are some 18-year-old going to look at you at 40 and go, oh, geez, I hope I don't end up like that. The observation here that's being made is, you are already trending towards the kind of 40-year-old you're going to be. If you are lethargic, if you're a person who's always pessimist and down, that's for sure going to be the kind of 40-year-old that you're going to be. And while we might joke and laugh about that, oh man, I would love to be that kind of old fart 40-year-old that, hates life. I don't think so. And I think Cicero is going to argue that as your body begins to deteriorate and you begin to have health issues, you very much will want the energy that you will need to be able to age with some sense of grace. So consider it now. Speaking of better, he makes this observation as well. He says, serious gravity, he says, I approve of in old age. But as in other things, it must be within due limits. In other words, a balance. This sounds very much like Aristotle. Now, bitterness, I can in no case approve. What the object of senile avarice may be, I cannot conceive. For there can be can there be anything more absurd than to seek more journey money, the less there remains of the journey? He makes an interesting observation. Why, in heaven's name, when you start getting really old, would you care about money? He says the last thing you should care about is money because you're about soon to die and you can't take that with you. Now, some have pointed out that collecting wealth as you age makes sense if you are going to do something creative with it, hand it on in some creative ways or whatever. I'm sure Cicero would probably agree with that, right? We think as well at level 3A of Wordsworth's little classic, my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. I get happy when I see rainbows. You remember this one. So was it when my life began? When I was a kid, I loved rainbows. So is it now I am a man? I love rainbows now. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. That's what Wordsworth says. As an old man, we would say today an old man, he wrote that and he said, I never want to get to a point in my old age where I don't just enjoy rainbows. In other words, I can't enjoy my life as a child enjoys his or her life. And then it finishes the poem by saying, the child is father of the man. And I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. Children have a lot to teach adults, in the same way that adults have a lot to teach children. Namely, remain young all your life, and then you'll never age, even if you do get old. Point number 4. The idea that old age is not far removed from death, and so as you get older you begin to worry more and more about death. The way this one is said is the nearness of death argument is in passage 19, and it's remarkable stuff. He says, there remains the 4th reason, which more than anything else appears to torment men of my age and keep them in a flutter, the nearness of death, which it must be allowed cannot be far from an old man. But what a poor dotard must he be, who has not learned in the course of so long a life that death is not a thing to be feared, death that is either to be totally disregarded, if it entirely extinguishes the soul, or is even to be desired if it brings him where he is to exist forever. A third alternative, at any rate, cannot possibly be discovered. Why then should I be afraid if I am destined either not to be miserable after death, or even to be happy? In other words, he says basically you've got 2 options in regards to this thing about death. One is that you die and you're like the dog rover and you're dead all over, which means it's over, it's done. That means there's no pain. The other is, for him, he says, you die and you go on to some kind of heaven type place and everything is great and you're happy. Either way, no pain, no suffering. He goes, either way, it's a win. So why are we so afraid of dying? This will sound very much like Plato's Phaedo, right? I gave a lecture on this at Harvard Classics number 7, right? He asks this question, what is a long life? But to my mind, nothing seems even long in which there is any last. For when that arrives, then all the past is slipped away. Only that remains to which you have attained by virtue and righteous actions. Hours indeed, and days and months and years depart, nor does past time ever return, nor can the future be known. Whatever time each is granted for life, with that he is bound to be content. I mean, we've pointed this out. At the moment of your death, it won't happen in the past, and it certainly won't happen in the future. When you die, it's not going to be the future. It's going to be now. And as we've said in our 4 quartets lectures, that means every breath is a death of a kind. And so young people as well as old people have to come to terms with the idea of dying, right? He talks about the harvest of old age. This is kind of a fun say. He says, now the harvest of old age is, as I've often said, memory and rich store of blessings laid up in earlier life. Again, all things that accord with nature are to be counted as good. In other words, he makes the observation, seniors actually enjoy high school far more than freshmen because seniors have 4 years of experiences on graduation day from high school that they can call back on. And all those memories, not all of them are happy, right? All of those memories are rich. They make you rich. That's the harvest, he says. But what can be more in accordance with nature than for old men to die? A thing indeed which also befalls young men, though nature revolts and fights against it. Accordingly, the death of young men seems to me like putting out a great fire with a deluge of water, but old men die, another simile, like a fire going out because it's burnt down of its own nature without artificial means. Again, in another simile, Cicero's brilliant with these. Just as apples, when unripe, are torn from trees, but when ripe and mellow, drop down. So it is violence that takes life from young men, ripeness from old. This rightness is so delightful to me that as I approach nearer to death, I seem as it were to be sighting land and to be coming to port at last after a long voyage. For those of you that know your Peter Jackson's film and the very final one, Return of the King, of course here we go, right? Taking that boat ride and all of that. It's a beautiful word picture. He says it this way, the young, in passage 20, the young must learn how to die. But to disregard death is a lesson which must be studied from our youth up. For unless that is learnt, no one can have a quiet mind. Die we certainly must, and that too without being certain whether it may not be this very day. As death, therefore, is hanging over our head every hour, how can a man ever be unshaken in soul if he fears it? I mean, what a beautiful idea to leave each day as if it's your last day. Now, of course, we can say that, but I think he makes an important point here about the propedeutic nature of these lines, that you got to learn how to live that way, so that you have the idea that, ever present in your mind. This may be the last time I get to do whatever it is I'm about to do. I want to do it with the best of my abilities. How would you have had a different high school experience or going on to college if you were able to approach your studies this way, right? So, for example, this may be the last lecture I ever study with McGee. I'm going to focus everything that's going on right here because it may be my last one. It seems to me, he says, that your life would be so much more rich if you could live this way, right? He finally says, the belief in soul, that is to say energy, should teach us, if energy is that which can be neither created nor destroyed, and you are fundamentally energy, well then there is no death, because death can't kill you, because you're energy. And you just said energy can't be destroyed. This, of course, that argument from Plato's Phaedo, as we've outlined it in Harvard Classics number 7, this is that classic statement, and here we're back to it again. He makes this observation this way. He says, the soul alone is invisible, alike when present and when departing. Once more you see that nothing is so like death as sleep, sounding very much like Hamlet, to sleep, perchance to dream. And yet, it's in slumbers that souls most clearly reveal their divine nature. I'm thinking of Freud here in interpretation of dreams, right? For they foresee many events when they're allowed to escape and are left free. This shows what they are likely to be when they have completely freed themselves from the fetters of the body. Wherefore, if these things are so, obey me as a god. But if the soul is to perish with my body, nevertheless, do you from all of the gods who guard and govern this fair universe perceive my memory by the loyalty and piety of your lives? In other words, he makes some pretty good advice here. If you're going to go on and die, then why not live a life that can be well remembered? Longfellow says in Psalm of Life, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime in departing, leave behind us footprints on the sands of time, footprints that perhaps another, sailing our life solemn and forlorn and shipwrecked, whether seeing shall take heart again. In other words, live a life so that when you're old, the young will want to emulate. It's an interesting idea. It reminds us of Yeats's sailing to Byzantium as well. Once out of nature, I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing. I'm ready to be done of this life, but still, that monument of an aging intellect that he talks about is significant. Try and leave your life as a monument of an aging intellect, we might say. Finally, the very final passage. It's so amazing. I'll just read it for you. It's some of the most quoted from classical antiquity. I think when people sometimes talk about classic texts, they're referencing the final observations, the final lines of Cicero's on old age. I love it, and I just want to read it again. And I hope maybe later, many years later, when you're older, you'll pick this up and you'll go, I remember this. The old man, he gave a lecture on this one. Again, is there not the fact that the wisest man ever dies with the greatest cheerfulness, the most unwise with the least? Don't you, we think of Scrooge, don't we, in the way that Scrooge sees his tombstone and then he's ready to start begging for one more day. Don't you think that the soul, which has the clearer and longer sight, sees that it's starting for better things, while the soul whose vision is dimmer does not see it? For my part, I'm transported with the desire to see your fathers. He's talking to these young men whose fathers have died. To see your fathers who were the object of my reverence and affection. Nor is it only those whom I knew that I long to see. It's those also of whom I've been told and have read, whom I've myself recorded in my history. In other words, if you believe in afterlife and the souls of those who have lived before, he says, won't it be exciting to meet those great people? When I am setting out for that, there is certainly no one who will find it easy to draw me back or boil me up again like a second Peleus. In other words, he says, no, I'm ready to go, right? Think about how different this is from T.S. Eliot's Hollow Men. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom remember us as if at all, not as lost violent souls, but only as the hollow men, the stuffed men. We say that in that lecture. T.S. Eliot says, the greatest fear we have is to die and we go sit down with our great-great-great-grandma. And she's going to look right at us with direct eyes and say, really? Really? This thing you're doing now that you call that a life? I gave all of those sacrifices so that you could live this thing you're calling a life? I'm ashamed. And we don't want to have that conversation, and so our eyes drop. Notice Cicero, I'm ready to have that conversation with my great-great-great-grandma. And I know, he says, when I show up, my great-great-great-grandma's going to go, high five, you've lived quite a life. Which is obviously a very interesting 3B question. Are you living a life right now, today, that your great-great-great-great-great-grandma would say to you, awesome job. I am so proud of what you're doing, who you are, the values that you have. Cicero says, I'm ready to go. You can kind of get a sense in these final lines that he's really asking these young people, and by definition and by extension, you and me, how about you? Are you ready? Nay, if some God should grant me to renew my childhood from my present age and once more to be crying in my cradle, I would firmly refuse. He says, I don't want to go back and do this thing again. Nor should I in truth be willing, after having, as it were, run the full course, to be recalled from the winning crease to the barriers. He says, you get to the very end of the race, and you're about ready to, my runners in the house will appreciate this. You get to the very end of our cross-country meet, and you're like dead tired, and you're pushing yourself to win the thing, and then 5 steps from it, you go, you know what, I'm going to back up and start all over. No. If you've run hard, if you've run well, then you're ready to go, right? For what blessing has life to offer? Should we not rather say what labor? But granting that it has at any rate, it has, after all, a limit, either to enjoyment or to existence. I don't wish to deprecate life as many men and good philosophers have often done, nor do I regret having lived, for I have done so in a way that lets me think that I was not born in vain. But I quit life as I would an inn. His word pictures are brilliant at 2B. It's kind of like a hotel, not as I would a home. In other words, this world is not my home, a famous gospel hymn says, right? For nature has given us a place of entertainment, not of residence. I'm here for a good time, not for a long time, is the point he makes. Oh, glorious day, he finishes, when I shall set out to join that heavenly conclave and company of souls and depart from the temporal and impurities of this world. For I shall not go to join only those whom I have before mentioned, but also my son Cato, who has already died, than whom no better man was ever born, nor one more conspicuous for piety. His body was burnt by me, though mine ought, on the contrary, to have been burnt by him. But his spirit, not abandoning, but ever looking back upon me, has certainly gone, whither he saw that I, too, must come. I was thought to bear that loss heroically, not that I really bore it without distress, but I found my own consolation in the thought that the parting and the separation between us was not to be for long. This is a brilliant, I think, observation by Cicero. He says, if you believe in an afterlife, then when somebody you love dies, you can say, I'm sad, but I know I'm going to get to see that person. It's an interesting argument. It's a great comfort, Cicero says. I lost my boy, but I get to go and see him. It's so great. He's been watching me the whole time. It's fine. And then finally, the last paragraph. It is by these means, my dear Scipio, for you said that you and Laelius were wont to express surprise on this point, that my old age sits lightly on me and is not only not oppressive, but even delightful. But if I am wrong in thinking the human soul immortal, I'm glad to be wrong. So it's the falliblest position, but it's a wonderful one. I'm glad to be wrong. Nor will I allow the mistake, which gives me so much pleasure, to be wrestled from me as long as I live. You can't change my mind about this, he says. But if when dead, as some insignificant philosophers think I am to be without sensation, I'm not afraid of dead philosophers deriding my errors. Again, if we're not to be immortal, it's nevertheless what a man must wish, to have his life end as its proper time. For nature puts a limit to living as